As I've mentioned before in previous teachings, within the book of Deuteronomy is an expanded outline of commandments that fall within the categories of the original 10 commandments or 10 words found in Deuteronomy 5 and Exodus 20. The Greek name for the book Deuteronomos or Deuteronomion means second law or repeated law because in chapter 1 and verse 5, we are told that Moses expounds on the law. In this book, he is repeating the commandments he was given 40 years early on Mount Sinai in order to prepare this new generation of Israelites who will enter the Promised Land. Before I continue, as a side note, I'd just like to mention that there are 3 different ways that most people divide up the 10 Commandments. There's a Jewish, a Catholic, and a Protestant version of the 10 Commandments. I'm not going to explain the differences here. You can look it up, or we can talk about it maybe another time. I just want to make clear that for this discussion, I'm working with a Protestant version taken from the Outlines of Bible Books by Lang, Ward, and Nelson, found in Accordance Bible Software. So let's get back to our discussion. This expanded outline of the 10 Commandments begins in chapter 6. From chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 11 and verse 32 is a very detailed look at the first commandment to have no other gods. Appropriately, the first passage of the Shema begins this outline. Our Torah portion this week covers the second, third, and fourth commandments in this outline. The second commandment to avoid idolatry is pretty much all of chapter 12. This section covers the laws pertaining to the sanctuary, what is to be sacrificed and what is not to be sacrificed. The third commandment to avoid blasphemy or not to take the Lord's name in vain is covered in chapters 13 and 14 through verse 21. Chapter 13 covers false prophets and idolatrous men who blaspheme the name of God. Chapter 14 covers the dietary laws. It explains how the people are to be holy through the food they eat and the food that they are to avoid. The fourth commandment to keep the Sabbath spans from chapter 14, starting in verse 22, through chapter 16 and verse 17. Here, the discussion of the Sabbath is expanded to the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, as well as the biblical Sabbaths. There is a lot more that can be mentioned and examined about this outline structure of Deuteronomy. I find it very interesting, but my focus this week is this. I think most would agree that the 10 Commandments are for all believers in Yeshua, whether Jew or Gentile. It's the details of each commandment that seem to trip people up. The details found in these expanded view of each of the 10 commandments. I'll give an example from our Torah portion this week. In chapter 14, in the details given about not taking the Lord's name in vain, Moses reiterates the dietary laws. What's the connection between the dietary laws and not taking the Lord's name in vain? Well, the name of the Lord is a representation of his glory, his majesty, and his supreme deity. The name of the Lord is holy, and he is holy, and Israel is to be holy as he is holy. Their diet, the animals that they eat or don't eat, is one of the things that sets them apart from the other nations. Eating unclean animals would render them unclean and therefore unfit to approach the altar and offer a sacrifice. So let's get back to our passage. We're going to look at Deuteronomy 14 and verse 21. At first glance, this verse seems to contradict the thought that the Torah is both for the native and the non-native Israelite. Here's what it says. You shall not eat anything which dies of itself. You may give it to the alien who is in your town so that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Here the word used for alien, sometimes translated as stranger, is the Hebrew word ger. This is a common designation used in the Torah to describe those from the nations who have attached themselves to Israel. This is why some teach that the dietary laws were not required of the non-natives in biblical times, and the dietary laws are not required of non-Jews today. But let's consider Exodus 12, verse 48 through 49. It says, if a stranger, this is the same word ger, if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger or the ger who sojourns among you. So before Israel leaves Egypt, before Israel arrives at the mountain to receive the Torah, God made a provision for the ger, for the non-native born person, to partake of the Passover. And then they would be like the native born. So if this is the case, why then in Deuteronomy 14 and verse 21 does it say that the alien who is in your town can eat an animal that has died if the rest of Israel is not supposed to? This does seem like a contradiction. But here's how we can understand this passage. It can be explained by looking at the other word used to describe a non-Israelite in Deuteronomy 14 and verse 21. Let's read it again. You shall not eat anything which dies of itself. You may give it to the alien, to the ger, who is in your town, so that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay, so here, foreigner is the other word used to designate someone who is not a non-Israelite. Here, foreigner is the Hebrew word nokri. And it could be used in this passage to describe a person who is just passing through, or someone who has no intention of being a part of Israel. They are a foreigner and they want to stay a foreigner. This word nokri, or foreigner, can help us understand the other word that is used in the passage, the word ger, or alien. I mentioned earlier that ger is commonly used to describe those from the nations who have attached themselves to Israel, but not all the time. And this is one of those instances where it is not referring to those people, but rather those who are in the town, but they have no intention of joining Israel. So they don't care to worship the Lord. They don't want to be a part of Israel. If we go back and look at the same commands listed in Leviticus 17, 15 through 16, we see that the ger in this passage must do what the native Israelites do. It says in this passage, when any person eats an animal which dies or is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or an alien, a ger, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and remain unclean until evening. Then he will become clean. But if he does not wash them or bathe his body, then he shall bear his guilt. So here in Leviticus 17, if a ger eats an animal that dies or is killed by a beast, he is unclean, just like the native-born person is unclean. And so he has to bathe and wash his clothes, and when the sun goes down, then he'll be clean, like the native-born person. Now, why would a ger need to be clean? And what is the purpose of being clean? Again, it's for the purpose of bringing sacrifices to the temple. An unclean person cannot come before the Lord to offer a sacrifice. The ger in this passage wants to be a part of Israel. The ger in this passage wants to worship the God of Israel. So the ger in this passage wants to be clean. You would not give them or sell them an animal that has died or was killed by a beast. So Deuteronomy 14:21, this passage that trips people up, it's a little bit difficult to understand, is referencing two types of non-Israelites who have no desire to join Israel or worship the God of Israel. The alien who is in this town, they don't care to be part of Israel. The foreigner who is probably just passing through, they have no intention in worshiping the God of Israel. If we go back to Exodus 12, but this time start at verse 43, we can see another example of these two words. Exodus 12 started in verse 43. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner," this is the word nekar, it's the same word as nokri, "no foreigner is to eat of it," talking about the Passover. "But every man's slave purchased with money after you have circumcised him, then he may eat of it. A sojourner or a hired servant shall not eat of it. It is to be eaten in a single house. You are not to bring forth any of the flesh outside of the house, nor are you to break any bone of it. All the congregation of Israel are to celebrate this. But if a stranger, a ger, sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised and let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native to the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. The same law shall apply to the native as to the stranger who sojourns among you. The same law shall apply to the native as to the ger." Here again, we see the foreigner, the person who has no desire to join Israel. They are not allowed to participate in the Passover. They have to be circumcised. They have to join Israel. They have to be like Israel and follow the laws that God has established in order to partake of the Passover. But the stranger, the alien, the ger, who wants to join Israel, well, they can partake of the Passover just as long as they're circumcised first. That's the requirement. That's the law that God created. They have to be circumcised before they can have the Passover. So they have to follow the laws given by God, and they do follow the laws given by God, demonstrating that they want to be a part of Israel, that they want to worship the God of Israel. So the Torah is for the non-native just as much as it is for the native-born person. So in Exodus 12, we see provision for the non-Israelite to partake in the Passover, the first of the 3 pilgrimage festivals. And interestingly, in our Torah portion this week, we also see provision for the ger, for the alien, to participate in the other 2 pilgrimage festivals, Shavuot and Sukkot. Chag Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 11, it says, "You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter and your male and your female servants, and the Levite who is in your town, and the stranger, the ger, and the orphan and the widow who are in your midst, in the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name," talking about Jerusalem. So we see that the celebration of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, is something that is inclusive. It's not just for the native-borns to go and celebrate by themselves. It's not just for the men to go by themselves and celebrate. It's not just for the adults. It's for the children. It's for the men, for the women, for the servants, for the Levites, for the widow, for the orphan, and of course, for the stranger, the ger, the alien. Everyone is supposed to come together and celebrate Passover, and now we see they're all supposed to come together and celebrate Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks also. Chag Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. We see in Deuteronomy 16, verses 14 through 15, it says, "You shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter, and your male and female servants, and the Levite, and the stranger, the ger, and the orphan, and the widow who are in your towns. 7 days you shall celebrate a feast of the Lord your God, in the place which the Lord chooses, because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and in all the work of your hands, so that you will be altogether joyful." Here again, we see everyone coming together to celebrate. Everyone is rejoicing together before the Lord in Jerusalem on the feast day. The native-born, the non-native-born, observing the feast together. This is one of the beautiful aspects of the Torah and God's plan for redemption. It's inclusive and it's expanding. It's not only for the native-born of Israel, it's for the nations that would attach themselves to Israel as well. So the people of God is getting larger. God promised Abraham that in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. Through Abraham's lineage, the nations of the earth, the ger, would be blessed. In passages like the ones that we've looked at today, we can see a picture of the families of the earth, all the nations being blessed through Abraham, through his descendants. God has kept his promise, and he continues to keep his promise. But it wouldn't be until after the death and resurrection and ascension of Yeshua Messiah that we would see this promise ultimately fulfilled. In Matthew 28, 18 through 20, Yeshua, talking to his disciples, says, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you today. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And so up to this point, Yeshua came for the Jewish people. Yeshua came for the descendants, physical descendants of Jacob. He came for his own. But we see that before he ascends, he now tells his Jewish disciples to go and make disciples of the nations. These were his last words before he ascended into heaven. We see Yeshua again instructing his Jewish disciples to take his words, his Torah, to the nations, the non-native people. And he tells them this so that they would bring them into the fold of Israel. And this is what it means that the families of the earth will be blessed through Abraham. Messiah would come through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and through him, the believing people of the nations would be grafted into Israel. And as one new man, they would be altogether joyful in the presence of the Lord.